Okay, we're in Isaiah chapter 4, sheltering with Jesus. We're going to have a little study here, a little encouragement to put our heart and our soul and our lives and our day-to-day experiences in the hands of Jesus. Isaiah chapter 4, verses 2 through 6 is our opening text. And I'd like to read that at this time. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion, and he that remaineth in Jerusalem, shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and shall have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning. And the Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For upon all the glory shall be a defense, and there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for a place of refuge, and for a covert from the storm and from rain. Let's pray and ask God's blessing on his word. Father, thank you for this text in Isaiah. Thank you for the great prophet Isaiah, one of our greatest major prophets that have his words have, and his authority has come thundering down through the ages, that we should come to you, that we should trust you, and that Jesus is our Messiah, Lord. And I pray today as we look at this text, as I expound upon it, and expound upon this sheltering that you and you alone can give. Help us to understand more. Help me to explain it in a good way, Lord. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, and keeping a little bit with the theme of Independence Day, there was a time, it was the year 1777. Well, what happened in 1776? We had our Declaration of Independence from Great Britain, wasn't it? But in 1777, it wasn't looking so hot for the American Revolution. It didn't look like it may not have been able to be pulled off. So the British Army, there were 13,000 men in the British Army, came up against these ragtag group of men, farmers and shopkeepers, and just people that felt the call of God in their lives to stand up against tyranny. Came upon these the American colonists. Now, the Continental Army fought as best they could, very valiantly, to hold back, but eventually the English took the city of Philadelphia. But before Philadelphia was actually abandoned, Congress ordered that every bell in the city be removed and hidden somewhere and placed in hiding. And the reason they did that was to prevent the English from confiscating these bronze bells and making cannons out of them, melting them down for cannons. In all, there were 11 bells that were removed, and one of which was the Liberty Bell that we studied about in grade school. Not only did they get the bells down from these very high steeples, but they also had to move them safely under the cover of night. But where could they hide these massive bells? There's some pretty good-sized bells in that time. Well, believe it or not, they hid them in basements of churches. And one of the churches that they hid most of them, or maybe all of them, I'm not sure from what I read, was a church in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is close to Philadelphia, if you're familiar with that. Now think about that. The Liberty Bell found shelter in a house that was dedicated to God. I think that's more than just a little ironic. I think it's prophetic. It's kind of a neat thought. And you could literally say the symbol of our liberty, the Liberty Bell, was sheltered by God. Now our text today is a prophecy from Isaiah. 700-800 years before the actual events that took place. He's making a prophecy. He's talking about God's people finding their shelter in something called the branch of the Lord here. It says in that day, in our text that we just read, in that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. and he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. The Lord will create over the whole side of Mount Zion and over her assembly a cloud and smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For all of the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade from the heat of the day, and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain. To reiterate what I already read out of the Bible. Now, everything in that prophecy, basically, when you cut it right down, it foretold of the branch of the Lord who would be our refuge. Did they understand that was going to be Jesus? No, they didn't. They did not understand that, but they knew that the Messiah was coming. We looked at that a little bit as Bryce brought out in Sunday school, that the branch, that there was prophecies made way back in the Old Testament that came to fruition, such as Melchizedek came to fruition when Jesus came to this earth. And it talked about the branch of the Lord would be our refuge from the heat of the day, and who would be a shelter in those times of storms. And that's what I want us to really focus on here. We're sheltering from the storms of life through our faith and our worship of Jesus and his divine hand in our day-to-day lives. Now, the first question is, people might ask, maybe someone that might take a cursory look at the Bible and say, well, who is this branch that God promises? Well, that would be, as they understood it, even that far back, would be the Messiah. That would be, as we know it today, Jesus. Now, if we go later on in the book of Isaiah, we're told that a shoot, quote, a shoot will come up, and this is in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. It says here, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch, okay, later on, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Every commentary that I was looking at, and probably every commentary that you'll find, says that's a reference, that is an allusion to the Messiah, and that's Jesus. We know who the Messiah is. They didn't have the comprehension in those days of exactly who the Messiah would be. They knew he was coming, they knew he had to have great power, but they didn't quite understand how he would come. Now, if you go to the prophet Jeremiah, who was also a very great major prophet of that time, a contemporary with Isaiah, he described the branch as being the coming king, the promised Messiah. He was a little more emphatic, a little more illuminated it a little bit more. He said in Jeremiah 23:5, if you'd like to look there, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is right and just and right in the land. Did you catch that as I was reading that? Jesus is our Messiah. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, our Jewish friends, the Orthodox Jews, still don't believe that the Messiah has come. They're still waiting. But with all the prophecies, it's hard for me and most of us and as Christians to understand how they could miss the fact that the Messiah has come and it's Jesus. There's so many prophecies that show that and portray that. Jesus is our Messiah. He's our King. Jesus reigns now, present tense, and he reigns in our world with wisdom, understanding, counsel, and might. Sometimes it doesn't look like that. And I know Bryce brought that out in the Sunday school class. That sometimes you look around and it doesn't look like things are going so well. But we know that God is in control of everything that goes on in our world. He has ultimate, and I was going to bring that out, but I'll bring it out now. He has ultimate sovereignty in our world. And we look around and we're so hopeless and we think the world's going to pot and we think that everything's going down and nothing's working right, but God is still in control. God is still on his throne. Whether we see it or not, all the time. He's our Messiah. He's our King. He reigns present tense. And He is your refuge. And He's your shelter. I love to camp. We haven't went camping. How long has it been since we went camping? Oh gosh, it's been years. Andrew was a little guy, but we love to go camping. We'd go up to St. Mary's, or we'd go to Madison. One time we went across Many Glacier, and one time when we first got married, we went across the mountain. What was the name of that one? Lake McDonald. And we got there, and this guy had lent us his tent. It was an Army surplus, one of these green tents, and it was a big one. We had to put this tent up, and it started raining, didn't it? And it rained, and it poured, and it rained. We got soaking wet. And we finally gave up and said, let's go. And so we got in the car, threw everything in the back of the car, and headed toward Kalispell. And here it was about 2 in the morning when we finally got just outside of Kalispell, and there was a motel that was open. And we went in, and the guy said, I'm not even going to charge you for this room because, you're not going to be there very long. But we were so tired. And we got in this room, and we just got in bed, and somebody out on the highway hit a skunk. And the smell of that skunk come right down in there. That was our horror story about camping. But we love to camp. But it's no fun, is it, when you get some rain? When the rain comes and your tent leaks, it's not fun anymore. When it's raining out, I want a shelter, don't you? Maybe even a canopy or something, A picnic shelter would be better than the tent we were stuck in, wouldn't it have been? Tents tend to leak. But even more than that, in a storm, I'd rather to be inside a cozy building like this church or my house, where the rain's going to be shed off of the roof. I want a shelter in the time of storm. And so God promises that this branch that He's talking about here in Isaiah and also Jeremiah is Jesus. He's the branch. I can emphatically say that. He will be our shelter from the heat of the day and a refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. Isaiah 4:6 that I read earlier. Jesus is our refuge and He is our shelter. And how many times do we go to our friends and people and maybe even listen to commentators on YouTube and the internet and stuff like that and go, man, this guy's got a good idea and this guy's got a good idea. And by the time you listen to all these people that have so many good ideas, you don't know whether to come or they're going. Why do we do that when we can go right to our Bible and hear what God has to say to us? Life is hard, isn't it? Even at its best, life is kind of hard. Some days really stink. But life without Jesus is really hard. I remember that. I remember before I got saved how hard life was, how meaningless it seemed to be. Some would put it this way: life is hard, but life without Jesus isn't just hard, it's empty, it's exhausting, it's almost unbearable. Now, why would I say that? Why would we think about that? Is that life without Jesus being empty, exhausting, and unbearable? Because without Jesus, folks choose a refuge that's poorly built. What was it? 3 weeks ago, I talked about the 3 little pigs. The one little piggy, he made the straw house, and the other little piggy made it out of sticks. But the one little piggy made it out of bricks, didn't he? And his foundation and his house stood the test because he made it out of the material that would stand the test. But the world today that doesn't choose Jesus as their Savior, they are going to face times of difficulty that will collapse when they face those storms. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 7:26 and 27, where He said, quote, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." Why did that house fall? Because the foundation wasn't there. If you don't have a good foundation, you can't have a house. You won't have a house that stands the storms. And I've talked to contractors. I've never done a lot of carpentry work, but they said you can, if you've got a halfway decent roof and a good foundation, you can take pretty much any house and make it work. But if your foundation's no good, you're done. You can't really fix a house that doesn't have a good foundation. It was poorly built, and that's why so many people fall. Their shelter, in a personal way, in a life way, the way they live their lives, is built on bad foundations. Somebody once told me not too long ago about the problems a friend of theirs was having. Now, this friend was really a nice guy. There's a lot of nice guys out there that aren't Christians. But anyway, he was easy to get along with. Nobody ever had a bad word to say about this guy. Very talented worker, but his life was falling apart. Everything he did went wrong, and he was bitter, and he began to become angry. And I was saying, okay, your friend, and I mentioned his name, and I said, well, does this guy know Jesus? And the guy says, no, I don't think he goes to church at all. I've never heard him say anything about spirituality. Well, I said, there's his problem. Without Jesus, life is hard. And like the guy that I quoted earlier, it's empty. Life without Jesus is exhausting and almost unbearable. And Jesus said, don't do that. Don't do it your way. Do it my way. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you will what? Find rest for your souls. Matthew 11:28 and 29. I quote that a lot. I read that a lot. I think of that a lot. My rest does not come from the things of the world. They fail me. You can relate to that. Your friends, your family, situations, circumstances, they fail you. Oh, it should have worked okay, but it didn't. Well, that's great. We trust in Jesus, right? Everything's hunky. One sweet song, no problems. Now that I'm a Christian, everything's wonderful, right? Can you relate to that? Never have a problem in your life? Well, no. That's not what Jesus said, did he? Jesus said, if we go into the verses before the text that I read in my opening, he said, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. Matthew 11:26 and 27, before the verse 11:28, where Jesus said, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He's the shelter. He's the rock. He's the foundation that gives us the hope to go through the day-to-day struggles of life and the harsh realities that we all experience. Jesus said, even for those of us who hear his words and do what he tells us, the rain is still going to fall. You're going to have a bad week. You're going to have a bad day. I had a guy tell me, this was years ago, I was going through a lot. A lot of it was my own fault. And he said, boy, Bill, you're having a bad year. And I said, said his name. I said, I'm having a bad decade. I had about 10 years there where just nothing went right. Everything went wrong. But Jesus said, even for those of us who hear his words and do what he tells us, the rain is still going to fall. But the difference is this: we won't be destroyed. We won't be dismayed. And we're not going to be destroyed because we built our lives on the rock, capital R. And that's Jesus. He's our shelter. He's your refuge. No substitute, no second best, no guru. I had a buddy of mine I went to school with. I said, hey, Richard, how you doing? He says, well, I'm learning from my guru. I don't know what a guru is. He's somebody out of India, I think. But I said, well, how's that working for you? He said, well, not so good. But he's studying his guru. I said, why don't you come to Jesus? He more or less said, well, that's too easy. I got to have a guru. But Jesus is our shelter, and he's the refuge that we're looking for. Now, our passage in Isaiah uses kind of an interesting Old Testament story here to illustrate what the promised Messiah was going to accomplish in our lives. Now, Isaiah 4:5 that we read said, the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and the shining of a flaming fire by night. Now, where did we hear that before? If you go back when the children of Israel were led out of Egypt by Moses and they came to the Red Sea, and what happened at the Red Sea? They came across on dry land, didn't they? God led Israel out of Egypt, and from the day they left Egypt until the very day that they came to the promised land, there was always a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day that they could follow. Those pillars of cloud and fire in Israel helped them through all those uncomfortable situations. They knew God was there. They could see that. They could follow the cloud by day. They could follow that fire by night. And they knew that God was there. They could sense that. One of the most dramatic situations they went through, as I said earlier, was that crossing of the Red Sea. God led the children of Israel to the Red Sea. Moses was their leader. He wasn't the best in the world. He says, I can't even talk good, God. I stutter. He says, well, and he says, no, I'll be with you. And he says, no, I can't talk. And finally he said, okay, your brother Aaron can talk for you. So Aaron did a lot of the talking for Moses. But Moses still was the great leader of Israel. Moses still, to this very day, is the greatest leader in Israel. He's the greatest hero of the Jewish people. But they followed the cloud. They found themselves, even though they're following the cloud, what happened? They come up to the Red Sea. And what happened? They saw that the chariots of the Egyptians were right on their tail. And they got frustrated, and they were mad. And they were mad. You know, they didn't blame God, they blamed Moses. It's always the way. If you got leadership position, they're never going to blame God. They're always going to blame. They're going to find a face that they can put on it. It might be your face. It might be Trump. It might be me. It might be anybody else. But they're going to put a face to it if something goes wrong. And what did they do? They complained to Moses. And if you go to Exodus 14 verse 11, it was they're whining here. I can only imagine they're whining. They're going, was it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us to die in the wilderness? And Moses' response was really classic. Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Exodus 14:13. The waters parted. We know the end of that story. The Israelites crossed on dry land, but the Egyptians didn't quite make it. And the Egyptians that the Israelites saw following them, they never saw them again. You know why? Because they're at the bottom of the Red Sea. What's my point? And maybe I'm wandering here. Maybe I'm a little bit windy. But what we see here is the Israelites faced danger. They even faced death. Yeah, they were in the clutch. No ifs, ands, or buts. But God led them through the storms that they faced, every single one of them. And we're told that the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Exodus 13:22. They knew it. They could see it. And they still whined. They said the language of the Exodus was murmuring. The people of God, in spite of their disobedience, in spite of their murmuring, were never abandoned and they were never forsaken. And that's our promise from Jesus. He'll never leave us and he'll never forsake us. Or as the 23rd Psalm puts it so well, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Jesus is our shelter. He's our refuge. He's that one who will guide us through the valley of the shadow of death. He will never abandon us through any persecution or trial. You can write that one down. Sometimes it's hard to see. You know, have you ever had that experience? I use that metaphor. You're up to your neck in alligators, and sometimes it's hard to remember you're supposed to drain the swamp. But let's never forget, we can drain the swamp in our lives. We can drain those things out that are hindering us and holding us back because Jesus is there. We can focus that we can do the work that God's put before us because He's there through any persecution, any trial. And as I said, He will never forsake us, even when we face death. Jesus said, come to me, in that text that I quoted earlier, Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and what? I will give you rest. But so here's the deal. Here's the deal that we need to really get in our minds and our hearts. In order for you to be sheltered by Jesus, for me to be sheltered by Jesus, in order for us to have peace and rest, we need to stay close beside Him. What does that mean? Prayer. Pray. Fellowship. We should have this place full, shouldn't we? We should be more fellowship. We should read our Bible regularly. How are you going to know what He wants if we don't? First thing you know, you're down at the bar with the bartender asking her what to do. The bartender will give you advice, but it won't last. We need to stay inside the shelter that Jesus supplied for us. Years ago, one of my preacher friends on the internet, I listened to a lot of his illustrations because he's got some good ones. He's a real old guy. He's quite a bit older than me, so he's experienced a lot. But he said he did a funeral for this old farmer, and this was down in Indiana where he's a pastor. And anyway, they went to the funeral home, and there were all the flowers, and there were the pictures, and all the mementos that you have at a funeral. But there was one odd item on one of the tables that was all by itself, and of all things, it was a pair of blue jeans. And these blue jeans had seen some better days. They were ragged, they were torn, they looked like they'd been hit by a bomb. And all the visitors stopped at that table, and they're going like, what are these blue jeans doing here that look like they've been burned up and shriveled up and all this and that? And they looked at those old pants for a few minutes as they entered in, and you see, this was the pair of pants this man was wearing when he got struck by lightning one time. Now, I'm not sure from what I read where he was when this happened. I don't think it said anything about it, but I can bet he probably wasn't inside his house. He probably wasn't in a car. He was out in the prairie, probably plowing in the field when he got hit by lightning. He wasn't in a shelter, is the point I'm trying to make. He was probably out there standing in his field, and he got struck by lightning because he wasn't inside a shelter, okay? And I think that illustrates a point that I'm trying to make this morning. In the same way, we need to constantly seek to be with Jesus. That's your Bible study, that's your prayer, that's your fellowship, that's your meditation time. Because He's our shelter. Anything else is a substitute, and a very poor one at that. Because He's our refuge. He's the one who gives us peace. He's the one that gives you rest and protection in those wee hours in the morning. You wake up and you go like, man, everything's going to pot all at one time. You ever felt that way? Then look to Jesus. Look to Him. He's the one that's going to give you peace. He's the one that's going to give you rest. And He's the one that's going to give you protection in those times. And He'll do the same for me too. I want to close with a story about some youth that were coming home from camp one night. And what happened was some of the boys went home with the preacher that night on the bus. And the night was kind of ominous. This was in Indiana again. This was my buddy in Indiana. And the wind was blowing pretty hard, and the sky was really dark, really bad. We don't have that here, but the air was oppressive. You guys from Oklahoma can relate to this. When it gets that heavy air, you could have a tornado. And these boys were thinking this could be a tornado. They were scared. They were getting concerned because they thought that there was going to be a tornado, or maybe there was even a tornado warning. And they decided a tornado could be a very real possibility. And this was not a casual conversation. They were not making fun or anything like that. They were serious. They were scared. And the more they talked about it, the more worried they got. And then one of the boys said something really smart. He said, "Hey guys, maybe we should pray about this." And that's what they did. And the pastor driving the van, he could hear them talk. He could hear their voices praying, and it was obvious they truly believed that God could protect them from that storm. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Why? For thou art with me. Jesus is our shelter, and he's our refuge. Have you come to that point? Maybe somebody by YouTube hasn't come to faith in Jesus. This is a day to do that. We all know somebody that hasn't. We all know somebody that's not saved. Let's go tell them this week. Let's share in some meaningful way that Jesus is the only refuge that we have, and do what God calls us to do. Maybe somebody needs to be baptized. I don't know what God is showing you, but whatever it is, you do that.